Our next guest is Grace Blakeley. Grace Blakeley is a staff writer for Tribune and the author of Stolen: How to Save the World from Financialization. Great question. Also has recent pieces out in Jacobin, of course. One titled Raising Interest Rates is about screwing workers, and the other, Billionaires Absurd and Growing Wealth Undercuts Democracy. Here, Grace. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me on the show. It's great to finally be able to join you.
I know. We've tried many times, and
Yeah.
the universe has like lots of other things in store for us. So this inflation issue is unbelievable. We opened the show. I had a conversation. Talked about how inflation is being used as a weapon, and simultaneously the weaponization of supply chain issues are used as a weapon for political divides and organizing and splinters. Tell us a little bit, what's behind this quote unquote inflation conversation.
Yeah, it's interesting actually. That piece that I had in Jacobin in the US, it was entitled Raising Interest Rates as a Way to Screw Workers. And in the UK, it was entitled Is a Form of Class War.
Oh, interesting.
I think that was a kind of interesting little difference there between like the US and the UK context. But I mean, basically, that is what it is. If you go back to the period during which this narrative that we're seeing being rolled out again was formed, it was the 1970s and 80s, when you had this argument being kind of trotted out by what was then seen as kind of very radical element of the right, what we now know as the kind of neoliberal movement. And their argument was that inflation, this is Milton Friedman saying, is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. Now, what was going on in the 1970s was that there was a dramatic spike in inflation, and that was driven by the formation of OPEC. That's that group of oil producing countries that got together, formed this group and said, we're going to control oil prices, basically. So you had two big spikes in oil prices in the early 1970s, and that drove up inflation for everything, because what are we learning now? What we've known for a very long time, it's that energy prices, and particularly oil prices, feed into the prices of so many other things. Now, that's particularly true for oil because it's used to make so many different things. Like oil is not just the fuel you put in your cars. It's also hydrocarbons in plastics. It's natural gas used for fertilizer. So fossil fuels are used across our economy. And also bear in mind that they're really important when we're thinking about global logistics and transportation, and that our economies, the UK and also the US, very, very dependent on imports. So all of that means that energy prices, particularly fossil fuel prices, feed into inflation. This happened in the 1970s, and that very radical right-wing movement said, this is because of unions. This is because workers are demanding too higher wages. And at that time, we had in the UK and to a lesser extent in the US, relatively strong labor movements that could really kind of bring the economy to a grinding halt if they demanded wage increases that the bosses didn't want to give. So this was really seen as a kind of wedge to basically divide public opinion and bash the labor movement. And it worked basically because a lot of the tools that had previously been used to combat inflation during the post-war period stopped working when you had this big change in energy prices. And really the result of that, in part, it was a significant part of why we got the neoliberal revolution, was to do with all these crises around how do you deal with inflation, and also the kind of general sense that the labor movement had gotten out of control. Here we are today, and the right is once again, even after a decade of wage stagnation in the UK, even after in the US, the average worker before the pandemic was as well off in purchasing power parity terms as they were in the 1970s. Even after all of that wage stagnation, they're trying to roll this argument out again. And that's why it's class war.
Well, and it's interesting. It is class war, but I love that in the American version, they say it's about screwing workers. And I want to highlight screwing workers because I think that the right wing, which I opened with on the show, the right wing understands that they have a problem in that they're trying to appear populist. Simultaneously, there's this labor movement that's growing. It is nowhere where it needs to be because of the failures of the last 40 years of the Democratic Party, siding with neoliberals and basically kicking out labor from the party while bringing in lobbyists who are union busters, in some cases lawyers who are union
Mm.
busters in the Democratic Party, all around the late 1970s when you were talking about this period. So these things all happened at the same time. But they know that they need, or at least the Steve Bannons of the world who are organizing this type of Republican Party, know that they need to have a robust populist movement that is disruptive enough and votes enough in specific districts, because it's all gerrymandered in the United States, that it's almost like death by a thousand cuts. They just need enough. And when I see the truckers in Canada, which of course now there's threats that they're going to be coming here for Super Bowl, they're going to be I was just actually at the Canadian border yesterday in outside of Buffalo, Niagara Falls, and we decided not to go across to Canada because of the truckers who were protesting at the border. And it's very fascinating because truckers are traditionally more conservative. They listen to conservative talk radio on these long haul routes, for several hours. They're on the road like 350 days a year or something like a little over 300 days a year. They're listening to conservative talk radio. But there's an intersection between supply chain, which is, people are saying is the excuse for inflation, and workers' rights and mandates, and all of these things are intersecting. So the worker aspect, to me, this is if the workers are frustrated, the Republican Party, the right wing, has found a way for what is horrible conditions for these truckers to channel into mandates, and then channeling the economy, using the economic situation to create a little mini movement, and then continue to blame the Democrats
Mm.
for inflation and the economy in an election year. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. I think what you've kind of put your finger on there is a problem that the left have had for a long time, which is that we tend to assume that any form of economic crisis that tends to squeeze workers will benefit the left. And that is just not true. It's not true today. It wasn't true after the financial crisis. And the reason for that is that the response to any crisis, the response to any kind of, crisis in living standards, financial crisis, whatever, the way that people make sense of that and the way that they respond to that will depend, to a great extent on the ideas that are, again, in the words of Milton Friedman, lying around at the time.
Ah,
The left, up until a few years after the financial crisis, did not have a strong populist narrative that was able to explain why people's living standards were falling in a way that people could relate to. The right had a very easy, very powerful, and very potent narrative. It was some sort of mix between the left, the center left has spent too much money. It's out of control, government spending. That's the reason for this problem. That's the reason for the financial crisis. And also, they've been letting in loads of immigrants, and those are the people who are stealing your jobs, using public services, using your healthcare. And without a powerful counter narrative to explain falling living standards in another way, that was what people immediately and initially latched onto. What you saw, years after the financial crisis, when we'd had the chance to build up a more powerful movement, Jeremy Corbyn in the UK, Bernie Sanders, Podemos, Syriza, all of these new movements that emerged all around the world, very much on the left, very much from a socialist perspective, said actually, no, the reason that you are doing badly is because all of the benefits of growth are being captured by an elite at the very top of our society. The same elite that caused the financial crisis, the same elite that imposed austerity, the same elite that has, been implicated in causing the climate crisis. All of these crises that we're dealing with today have been caused by basically a small number of people at the very top of society who are in control of our big corporations, our big banks, and the revolving door that exists between those institutions and the government. And that narrative was very powerful and very popular, but for a number of reasons, which we probably don't have time to go into today, it wasn't the one that ended up sticking. Yet, I think today, the right is aware that there is some kind of latent enthusiasm for this way of explaining things, particularly when, we've seen over the course of the last couple of years during the pandemic, billionaire wealth skyrocket.
Right.
A few people do extremely well, while others were made to, again, bear the costs of this crisis. So as you say, they have to kind of find all these little ways of cutting up that potential coalition, because that's what they're really trying to do. They are really trying to undermine class solidarity. Bernie actually had a great quote, which was something along the lines of, if there's going to be a class war in this country, it's about time the working classes won it, which I think really gets that point. There's much class solidarity among this elite, and it's their job really to keep working people disorganized, and not having that kind of coherent narrative.
That's right. And it's almost like political jujitsu, right? They're taking an energy that exists and channeling it into something, which is what, Trump did so well. It's the Mexicans' fault. It's not, your employer's fault. The good news is that a lot of people are waking up to that's just BS. The bad news is that's not how electoral politics works in this country. You just need enough votes, not all of the votes or a majority of the votes. You just need enough in a coalition. I want to end with one question. I know we don't have a lot of time today, but love to have you on again because this is
I would love to come back.
Big conversation, super fascinating.
The smart women about socialism.
Yes, it's my favorite. But the other aspect of this is and it again goes back to the late 70s when a lot of these free trade agreements took hold. And I think about it every single time I hear about the supply chain is, we're obviously Western, northern capitalist countries that are consumer-based economies. Our economy is entirely consumer-based as much as they want to manipulate it in different ways. And free trade and the supply chain all intersect here and this all kind of came about at the same time when labor, of course, was attacked. And in 2016, during the presidential race, this was a big dividing line between the Clinton coalition and the Bernie coalition. Was you had some more progressive labor unions and membership, even if their leaders did not endorse Bernie Sanders. The membership recognized that the free trade agreements of the late 70s and, of course, mid 90s, early 90s made a huge difference in how strong labor is in this country. Well, now we're seeing, if we haven't seen the last 2 years during the shutdowns, we're seeing it immediately. So, they're blaming, the elites are blaming, the CEOs are blaming the supply chain, which is their economic model, by the way, but they're also increasing the costs while they're making record profits. So which is it? Is this a dilemma for them, or is this an opportunity for us to say, no matter who you blame, you're at fault?
Yeah, obviously a big part of why we experience such kind of economic turmoil when different parts of the global economy shut down at different times was because of the just extraordinary interconnectedness of the world economy.
Mm-hmm.
And even, the virus itself spread through supply, through kind of trading routes from kind of city to city to city and then out from there. So, these kind of the classic thing to say at the beginning of the pandemic was we are all going to be affected by this because of the way that, these just-in-time supply chains work. Businesses are keeping less inventory. They're relying on shipments coming in very, very quickly to translate those inputs into the products that they're producing. Another really interesting part of this is actually the way that global shipping has changed.
Right.
You've got these huge container ships that have to be very carefully organized when they're going in from one port out of another port. They take days and days to unload. A load of those ships just ended up basically floating around the ocean or just docked somewhere with all the workers trapped on board.
Can I just add something to this? I flew in yesterday, as I mentioned, into New York City, and we were going into JFK, and it was at nighttime, and I saw these ships, and I was like, what are they doing? They're just sitting. And of course, all these things were going in my mind. There were dozens of them. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but I just saw that last night.
Actually, I personally just am very, very interested in shipping just as like a thing because it's a fascinating thing. Containerization is one of these really not spoken about things that just transformed the global economy. And if you look at what's happened to global shipping over the course of the last couple of years, A, it's been massively disrupted, but B, the working conditions for some of these workers who are often sailing on these boats, which are, on the seas under flags of convenience, which basically means, they are using the labor laws of countries with the worst kind of labor laws that you can imagine. Some of them have literally been trapped on boats for years, unable to get off because they weren't able to kind of get off at the ports because the countries wouldn't let them in.
Wow,
it's really horrendous conditions, and what were already very difficult conditions for these workers. So, that whole model has been really pushed to breaking point, and we're going to continue to see this, I think, because, a kind of system as intricate and complex as global logistics can't just be shut down and then resurrected as it was before. We're really going to have to rethink how a lot of this stuff works. So supply chain issues are a massive thing, are going to continue to be a massive thing. And that coordination, which allows, chip manufacturers in Southeast Asia to
Right.
coordinate with manufacturers in another part of Asia, to coordinate with consumers and managers in different parts of the world, that's all going to take a very long time really to reconstruct, to make it work again in any meaningful way. But the other thing, I think, when we talk about supply chains, we're maybe not we could overemphasize that as actually one of the big causes of inflation, because if you really
Right.
drill down into the data and you look at what's actually causing inflation, what the consumer is feeling, it is energy prices. And this
Mm.
really, I think, does give us a bit of a wake up call. It's that we need to come up with a more sustainable, cheaper source of energy that can last us into the future, and also kind of allow us to decarbonize. Because oil prices sunk to zero during the pandemic. Everyone was like, great, it's the end of big oil.
Mhm.
Of course, they immediately rebounded when economic growth started again. And now we're seeing this massive, massive uptick, which is all benefiting the big oil companies. Exxon had its most
That's
profitable
right.
year in 7 years. All the big oil companies are having bumper profits. They're distributing it to shareholders. They're largely not using it to try and decarbonize as they promised they would. We really need to just get these companies out of our economy and start transitioning towards renewables.
Yeah, you can't just put a sweater on, as Jimmy Carter said. Even though my my heating company, my power company, emailed me today saying we know that rates are higher than normal as I'm wearing a sweater. My goodness, just stop consuming. I think that's the alternative. Maybe Joe Biden should say, guys, you know, maybe you don't order everything off of Amazon every 5 seconds. I'm just kidding. Like, it would be nice if you actually cracked down on these companies. Grace, super insightful, rapid round conversation. Thank you for joining us. Let's have you on again very soon.
Thanks for having
And
us.
have a great night. I know you're out in the UK right now, so
Thank you.
thanks for
Thanks.
joining us.
Bye.